This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 123, Taxing the Multinationals.
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, taxing the multinationals. Is it possible to do anything to stop them paying less tax by making most of their money where the corporate tax is lowest? We'll look at how they do it and how we can stop them, if we can stop them, today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, what got me onto this subject? I was watching an interview with, you probably know him, the American economist Michael Hudson. In fact, I've been reading some of it.
Yeah, good friend of mine.
I love his writing as well, I have to say. He was talking about balance of payments and how he worked for Standard Oil. And he was trying to work out where they made their profits. And in explaining it all, it just explains so simply how simple it is for multinationals to basically, do transfer pricing. Because, he said their profit was all coming from countries like Liberia and Panama, countries that only use the US dollar. They've got their own currencies, but they're worth exactly the same as $1. They're pegged 1-to-1 to the dollar, so everyone just uses the US dollar. Oil companies sell cheaply to their operations in these countries where they do nothing with them. They don't pay any tax, but then they sell them on at a very high price to their refineries in Europe and America, where the price is so high that they don't pay any tax because they're not really making any profit. It's as simple as that. And that's the way multinationals work. It was then, and it still is now, and it doesn't seem like we can do anything to stop that happening.
Yeah, look, I've known this for about 45 years, 50 years. Because of as well as they're doing work on multinationals and how they do their transfer pricing and so on. One of my good friends back at Sydney University is a guy called Greg Crow, and Greg was working for a while on the Transnational Research Centre at Sydney University, founded by Ted Wheelwright. So I was aware of all these shenanigans, from Greg's research. And Ted Wheelwright's research as well. But I also had just a little cameo once. I remember it's still one of those things that sticks in your mind. And why does it stay in your mind? But it did. And this is at a party with a bunch of my friends back when I was a 20-year-old rather than a 65-year-old as I am now in the mid-20s. And I was talking about Greg's research to a computer programmer. And he said, oh, look, I get experience of this all the time. He said, I work for a multinational. I've forgotten which one it was. And he said, I rang up one day to get some advice about a particular subroutine in our database system. And he said he's good friends with a person in the account section. And the person in the account section, that telephone call cost us $10,000. And he went, what? And he said, that's the price the Americans charge if we ring up for advice, $10,000 an hour. Now, that's inside the same company. Okay. Yeah. So a telephone call, which, might have cost, $10, let's say it was $10 a minute back in those days. So that the cost of the company was $30. The guy on the other end was probably being paid something in the order of $30 an hour. Let's imagine the whole thing cost 40 or 50. The transfer pricing level the company put on that was $10,000. Because the tax rate in Australia was higher than it was in America.
So to get to the bottom of things like that, to try and say, well, okay, we need to ensure companies aren't doing this transfer pricing, that is forensic analysis that's needed to try and find out how they're trying to cheat the system or beat the system. And cheat away is cheating.
It is cheating. It's frankly cheating. And this is where a large part of the accumulation of wealth has come from over the last 30 or 40 years. And we know how extreme it's got. Because the money which is supposed to be taken out of the accounts of people according to their income scales and taken out of companies at a flat rate is manipulated internally by people using tax havens. We all know about the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, et cetera, including up to and including the Prime Minister of the UK. By the looks of it, his dad was using one of these schemes, and there he is supposed to be the one managing the taxation system, and his family is involved in I think Cameron, one of them was involved. We know that from the Paradise Papers. That's at the personal level. But the really big stuff happens with the transnational corporations at the international level. And this has become a total farce because, of course, many, many countries have gained, tiny countries have gained a benefit out of slack policing of transnational taxes and often charging lower taxes in the first place. And that's where they've got their alleged operations and their alleged profits.
And this is why so many US companies have so much money sitting overseas, which of course is what Donald Trump was trying to stop, or at least I don't think he was trying to stop it, at least trying to get that money to come back into the United States. So the US had $2.5 trillion sitting overseas. Obviously, that's not good for the US balance of trade either, so you've got, US companies making big profits, but the money's not being repatriated. So it doesn't appear as a balance of trade, benefit. So Donald Trump offered them a tax break last year. Repatriate your profits and pay a one-off tax of 15%. Seems like a smart move. It doesn't solve the problem, but at least it gets that money back from Panama or wherever it's sitting. Maybe a short-term smart move, but on the other side, it's sort of like helping those companies, isn't it? Saying, well, if you continue to misbehave, if we give you an amnesty like this, then, even better. You can get the money back where you want it.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems about trying to use income tax in the first place as the basis of taxation in a modern society. Because when you look at where income tax comes from, I think it dates from, it's around the time of the First World War. It hasn't been something which was permanently a way of funding government. And of course, the scale of government now is far larger than it was back in those days. So I don't know the precise figures for the American economy, but I believe that the rough scale of the level of government expenditure when this Great Depression hit was of the order of 5 to 7% of GDP. After the Great Depression and after the Second World War, it leapt to 25 to 30% of GDP. Now, in that situation, you had to get a larger tax source because this comes down to how money is created as well. So I'm not saying the government has the tax to spend by any means, but it doesn't. But when it's spending that much money into the economy, if you're talking about spending, let's say, 7% of GDP into the economy from your capacity to create money as a government, then you don't need a large tax base to claw a fair bit of that back until the amount of money you're creating is roughly equivalent to the increase in the size of the GDP of the economy divided by how often money turns over. And that's my little metric for how much of a deficit a government should normally run. So when you're talking back in the days of the pre-Great Depression, 7% of GDP is your level of spending, money turning over about twice, two to 2.5 times per year. You needed a deficit of about 3% of GDP to create the extra money that the economy needed to expand at that rate. And wow, that's pretty much what the government was doing, funding itself by largely tariffs and so on and so forth. That was the custom duties and so on, and sales taxes and so on were the main form of taxation back then. And of course, you can't evade customs because you've literally got the goods at the door. You've got to get it, from the ship to the port. You've got to pay your customs duty, and you can't evade sales tax as well. Now, of course, income tax comes in to fund a much larger level of expenditure. And when that began, that was in some ways before the days of the truly transnational corporations.
So you're talking income tax or company tax? So
income tax, right. Income tax. But company tax existed as well, but I don't think, again, it wasn't anything like the scale that it was before the Great Depression. So the increase in the scale of government meant that most of the burden for this hoovering the money the government's creating back out of the economy, which is fundamentally what tax does, that burden fell on income tax. And when it began, with progressive income taxes, of course, you had in the UK, we all know that the Beatles were talking about leaving the UK because they were paying a 99% rate of income tax. And of course, if you're paying that much tax as an individual, you're going to say, how's Monaco these days? And move out. So that's fair enough. But for the corporations, this was how do we manage to minimize the amount of money the government's sucking out of what we've managed to pull in ourselves from our sales. And the easiest way was to operate in 2 countries, persuade one of them to offer you nice little perks in return for you moving your operations there but paying no tax. And that's what you did. And that has completely perverted the income tax system and the corporate tax system that we now have.
Well, I think in the situation that Michael Hudson was describing, I don't think this oil was going to Panama. It was just the money was going to Panama and then out again. It was all just accounting, wasn't it? But it was, it's all to try and avoid, by and large, paying tax, corporate tax. So if no countries charge corporate tax, wouldn't that stop this sort of transfer pricing happening?
Well,
and the only reason I say it, and maybe seems like an unbelievable dream, but I mean, countries could say, well, look, we're just going to tax people for the income that they make, and we're going to charge them more, and we're not going to tax companies, because that would mean hopefully there would be more money paid to the employees.
What do you think Rupert Murdoch would pay his tax?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always going to be people avoiding.
The thing is, the wealthy can avoid income tax. This is the thing. Okay?
Well, and they can avoid corporate tax, clearly.
Yeah, they could. So, in other words, I don't think anything based on income is going to work. Because what happens, I mean, again, let's get back to let's not start on a wrong foot here, because the usual argument, the government has to tax in order to spend. It's not. The government has to tax to take the money out of existence that it's created by its own spending, because it's now spending at the order of 30% of GDP. If you had 30% of GDP as literally financed by spending without taxation, then you would have, that's about 10 times, 5 to 10 times the rate of growth of the nominal economy. You would have runaway inflation, absolutely no doubt about it. So you simply have to do is find some way of hoovering back up the money that you're creating by spending in the first instance. Now, income tax has now been completely perverted. Income tax and corporate tax have both been completely perverted by the wealthy. And that what it means is, therefore, the hoovering burden falls upon the middle class. And this is where the middle class has started to vote for characters like Trump to say, we're going to reduce your tax rates. So you end up with it becoming it's a boost for right-wing politics.
Land tax, then, instead. Tax people on the size of their estates, perhaps, if you want to reach those people. But I mean, it does seem that governments are struggling to try and put rules in place to try and offset transfer pricing. In fact, supposedly there was an agreed standard set by the OECD, which says tax paid in any country should be based on three things: the activity that's performed there, the assets that company holds there, and the business risk it bears. So that would explain why Google pays very little tax. Most of its activity is in the UK, in the US, I should say. So that's where the activity is performed. It's basically a sales function everywhere else. They've got very little in the way of assets. They've just got an office somewhere in each of these countries. Yeah. And the business risk it bears, well, they bear no risk whatsoever because, they're just selling stuff that's created overseas.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is the only way we can actually get around this is to use a transactions tax.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you're going to spend that money, when people buy something off you, then of course that expenditure occurs in a particular geographical location, and you can tax the transaction, and you can tax the transaction on the purchaser, you can tax it on the retailer, you can tax it on the supplier. There's three possible ways, and there's no real way for them to evade that unless they're going to try to go to a cash economy. And with three institutions doing that, one of them is going to be legal about it in a sense. They're not going to be practicing fraud over it. They're going to record their cash transactions. So you have a way to capture it that way. Right.
But the final transaction, or the transaction from one company to another?
I'd go for the internal transactions.
Right.
Again, like the value-added tax, which is supposed to do that, of course, is horrendously complicated. I don't think of anybody who's got a small business who explain how difficult it is to fill out value-added tax or business activity statements and all the rest of the stuff you've got to do that way. But it's a much lower rate of taxation, but occurring in every last damn transaction. And with the intention of getting the bulk of that up to the point where you have taken out enough money to not be generating an inflationary level of demand in your economy. That's what I should see as the objective. And I think one reason why we don't get there is because the people who are making decisions about what we tax and how we tax and so on are still thinking government has to tax to spend. And that sort of constrains thinking dramatically.
Yeah. But even when you start talking about transactions, even that can be cheated, or if not cheated, it can be moved around. So let me give you an example. I do a podcast for a foreign company, an Australian company. I live in the UK. They pay me in Australian dollars. Now, I guess if it had been a different conversation, they could have paid me in sterling. That would have meant that my income within this country was higher, and I would be paying VAT. The fact that it's seen as foreign earnings means I don't get over the VAT threshold with the work that I do here. So I just, one phone conversation says, could we do this a different way? And I'm a one-man business. So it shows, if I can do that, imagine what large businesses can do.
Yeah, but if there was like a flat tax on the transaction itself, and then that applied wherever it was, let's say it's 1% or 2% of the turnover, even less than that, maybe 0.5%.
Yeah.
Then that tax is paid for every last transaction done between you and the foreign company.
Well,
wherever it might occur.
Yeah, But then, how do you get around? That is a bit like what the UK government is trying to introduce, of course, with the digital services tax. So they're saying they've started a consultation process on this just now. They want to introduce it by 2020. They're saying a 2% tax on the UK revenue of digital businesses. Not quite sure why just digital businesses, but anyway, but companies that are considered to derive significant value from the participation of their users, whatever that means. That's on revenue, not profit, in other words. So in effect, it's saying to Google, yeah, if you're making sales here, we're going to tax you irrespective of your profit. We're going to tax you on 2% of the revenue that you make in this country. But that is just an end tax. That's not the processes that happen before that, the transfer payments that might happen before that.
I think the trouble is that stuff has to be internationally coordinated because countries will still try to find areas where they can move. But ultimately, if you're going to be making money out of English consumers as Google, then you've got to have transactions with them. And, I mean, you can imagine people using VPNs and all sort of stuff like that, virtual private networks to evade the geographic location they're supposed to be at. But then you've got the VPN itself.
But you still got to pay, and you normally have to pay with the UK credit card. So they aren't. So I mean, you can catch people that way. On that, Google paid £49 million on profits of 202 million last year in the UK.
Hang on a second. Are there 49 million on profits of 200 million or billion?
No, 200 million profit. But the company is making. The company is making £9 billion dollars a year. They're making profits of 202 million in the UK, but their revenue in the UK is $7 billion. So $7 billion, I'm switching between dollars and pounds here, but they make $7 billion in revenue from the UK and 202 million in profit. They're not a very effective operation in the UK, it would seem.
Because the tax rate is higher here than it is elsewhere. Yeah. Which is why
they would say the cost of so how do they do that? I mean, it's clear transfer pricing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Because what are their costs here? You'd have to say it's an incremental business. They're a US business that's expanded overseas. They've done all of their development work for the United States. They can attribute some of that cost here, perhaps, but most of their cost here is the incremental cost of putting a sales team here.
Yeah, and I think also the head office in Europe is based in Ireland, I think, to take advantage of low corporate tax rates there.
Yeah.
So they're certainly manipulating. And they think this is, I think it was old Kerry Packer, those three people that don't know as Australia's, one of Australia's leading billionaires, before his death. And certainly with the most colourful personality amongst the billionaires. And he was...
That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about him.
He was actually, I bumped into him, one of all places. I bumped into Kerry Packer when I was training for a triathlon in the pool of the Consolidated Press building in Pitt Street. And I was doing, power laps. I was starting to do 60 laps of a 22-meter pool and see how fast I could do it. I was never a good swimmer. And I just went into this hulking sape that was in the other lane, just sitting there about 20 or 30 laps before I finished. And when I finished, there was Kerry Packer. And he said to me, I wish I could do that. And I said, we all make our choices, Kerry. And he said, yeah. And I hopped out of the pool.
End of conversation. All right. So what were you saying about him? Oh, you've lost your train. Oh, okay. No, that's good.
No, I haven't lost my train of thought. The laps kept me in line. He said, nobody, if you pay any more tax than you're bloody well, you're an effing idiot, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So, in other words, and what you have, if you, like you and I, there's no way I have time, but I get my tax done about 6 months too late. I get warnings about it being about to be overdue, and I have shoe boxes with records, and if I'm lucky, most of it I give up on paper these days. I'm just doing electronic. I haven't got time in my own personal life, by any stretch of imagination, to manipulate my taxes. But Kerry Packer can hire an entire team to do that. And one of the problems about trying to do this by regulation and so on is that the team he can hire is going to be paid a damn sight more money and have a damn sight more motivation too than the people working in the tax offices themselves. So what the tax offices end up doing, and we've seen massively horrific stories about this from Australia, they go after the easy targets.
Yeah.
So in every way, the tax office ends up persecuting the little bloke and letting the big guys get away with it. And of course, because the big guy, they know they take the big guys on. They're in a hiding to nothing to lose when they get taken to the High Court over it. The small bloke can't even afford to go to the magistrate's court.
So what's your take on this idea by Donald Trump then? For all this money, this $2.5 trillion that's sitting overseas from US companies, trying to get them to come back, repatriate that money by paying a one-off tax of 15%. Was that a smart move? Because it looks like, this is an opportunity for the owners of those companies to get their hands on the cash that's sitting overseas. They know if they bring it back here, they're going to get taxed heavily. But he's given them an opportunity to bring it back, which they've used, of course, to buy back shares in those companies. So their own shareholdings in those companies increase in value. So they're better off as a result of it. So, I mean, it's
a lose-win for them. And this is the trouble. There's just the wealthy have got all the potential mechanisms to get around this stuff, and there's no real way to stop them. Even if you go on transactions, of course, they make less transactions, but they still make financial transactions. Now, I'd like to see the idea of a transactions tax, of course, can be applied to financial transactions as well. So you can catch a lot of this stuff as well, including, of course, in that case, the increase in the value of their shares.
But how do you do it with internal transfers if you're treating them as transactions? Because companies will, because then you get back into the whole forensic accounting argument, don't you? What's an internal transaction within a company? Easy to track, smaller company. Again, you're going to get the smaller guy, aren't you? Because they deal with other suppliers, so there's more steps involving more companies, so those transactions are more transparent. If you're trying to take through the supply chain, which is largely a vertically integrated company, where are those transactions happening? They're not happening. It's all just one company.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. You certainly, what ends up being the problem is that there's a redistribution of the burden of taking the government's money out of circulation, that falls upon the working class and the middle class rather than falling upon the wealthy. And therefore the wealthy manage to accumulate more of the money that's created every year. They've got to make a profit to do it, but that's a step in the process of accumulating that money and building it up. And of course, getting wealthier, by paying less, but by returning less of the money that they get their hands on than the working class or the poor can do. And that, I think, is capitalism.
So maybe the Chinese approach makes more sense. The Chinese approach where they say you can only trade here if you set up a partnership with a local company. We don't want multinationals behaving in multinational ways. If you are forced to set up with a local company, then basically we know how much money you're earning and the money's staying in the country and we can tax it.
Yeah, I think you have to do something like that as well, because, the Chinese did it to develop a capitalist class in China out of the transfer of American technology through the free trade zones they established back in the early 1980s. And I've actually personally saw that happening, back when it occurred in 81, 82 in the Shenzhen free trade zone. So it's a very clever mechanism. And it also basically says you do not have complete freedom of capital. And this is a great one of the great traps of capitalism is the economic theory that argues everything works better if things can move freely without obstruction. Now, it is a damn sight harder for a worker to make a move than it is for a capitalist profit to make a move. And that is, again, skewed in favor of the wealthy. So if we want a society which is not going to have social breakdown, and I think capitalists like Nick Haneur have pointed out that the pitchforks are coming as these trends continue. If you want a society to continue functioning, you have to stop this exaggerated increase in inequality that can come out of a trading system. And the way to do that, one of the ways to do that is say, okay, we're not going to let you become totally multinational. If you want to operate in another country, you have to have a domestic partner. They have to own a certain percentage of the business and wear it or don't come.
So why aren't more countries doing that? Why wouldn't Europe do it, for example?
I think it's, again, just an ideology thing. This is the neoclassical ideology, this vision of free movement of capital and labor, this fantasy world they have, which, where that leads to an optimal outcome for everybody, et cetera, et cetera. It's like breakfast cereal for these people. They consume it so often they don't even realize what they're eating. And that ideology prevents you making fairly sensible moves like that. And of course, the Chinese didn't start with that ideology. They began with a completely different ideology. So there's no particular big shakes for them to say, okay, if you want to start, and this is literally what they said, if you want to establish operations in our free trade zone, you must have a Chinese partner. And we don't care how the capital is raised, but within 5 years, they must own half the business. Now, this again is another example of how multinationals
because they know by doing that, the money is going to stay in the country.
And they're going to develop a local capitalist class, and they're going to get technology transfer, all of which worked brilliantly for China. That was my, I remember that, vividly remember that meeting where that strategy was explained to me and my group of journalists I took there back in 81, 82. And it was, we'd been through all these bloody spiels from all these, show communes that were trying to convert from a socialist to a capitalist system, which were a total farce. We didn't think any of them were going to work. This time, the listener thought, this is going to work. This is clever. It's going to work. And because the wage differentials at that stage, I don't know what Chinese workers being paid back in 81, 82. I knew then, I can't remember now, but it would be well under, it would have been in cents per hour versus, tens of dollars, $10 per hour for the American workers. So the American multinationals looked at that. And even though they were being told they had to hand effectively half the ownership of the business within 5 years, the profits they were going to make, even out of half the business, was so great that it was worth them screwing the local workers and shutting down the production and moving it off to China, which is what they did.
Yeah. So if companies, more countries did this, like say, for example, Europe did, and it seems like a huge opportunity for Europe. I mean, seeming as, relations are bad with America, might as well do it now. What have you got to lose? This would be almost the perfect opportunity to say, well, look, if you want to operate in Europe, yes, you've got to partner with a local company. Then, say, for example, I don't know, we suddenly discovered there's massive oil reserves underneath, the Alps.
Brussels.
Underneath Brussels. Okay.
Brussels. Yeah,
so we're going to dig out Brussels and,
good idea.
and couldn't happen to a nicer place. But it has to be done with a local company, because then they're not going to ship all the profits offshore. At least half of it is going to stay within the European Union.
And you base it on transactions as well and make it harder to do that, because, if anybody breaks the law in that situation, Standard Oil or whatever it's now is would say, so sue me, international courts. But if you've got a domestic one, it's a domestic company facing rather more serious ramifications from fraud.
Yeah.
So it is something that you need ownership changes as well as a change to a more transaction-based system rather than income tax.
This, of course, will never happen.
Of course not.
So the situation is just going to continue as it is, and we are going to keep on, trying to introduce, because it's interesting that, we've, the UK is saying, yes, we're going to charge 2%, a tax on the big digital players. But we've got a tax now in the UK, what's called a diverted profits tax. It's been around since 2015. It's 25% of diverted profits. So if it's discovered that a multinational corporation has moved money that should have been paid here, then they're going to get taxed at 25% of that moved money if the case is shown. And they made it 25% so that it's higher than the level of corporation tax here. So you think, okay, well, if we get caught, we're going to have to pay more than corporation tax. So maybe we should pay the corporation tax. But the income from that last year, from this diverted profits tax, was £388 million, which sounds a bit like a drop in the ocean, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the trouble again, because it's only going to be a small cases that can be prosecuted. And if you try to take these people on, they fight you for years in the courts, because all they're doing is, feeding their sons and daughters who might be lawyers. So it's very easy to delay this stuff when it involves proving that there was a profit made in the first place, or proving that you had somehow diverted your profits. It's really, really complicated. And the better quality accountants and the more highly motivated and certainly more highly paid work for the ones trying to evade the taxes rather than the ones trying to capture them.
So this idea of forcing partnerships is almost breaking down the size of these monopolies, isn't it? And is that the end game? Is that what we should be doing, or are the benefits of having large multinationals? Obviously, they're offering services cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are advantages, because they wouldn't form in the first place if they weren't being successful compared to the marketplace in general. And again, this is where economic theory throws a whole lot of useless myths in the way that stop people thinking soundly about it, because the vision that they have of all these, a bit like you and I are pretty close to the vision of a neoclassical profit maximizing firm. And we're a sole operator, sole employer, you do everything, yada, 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 our own marketing, our own production, et cetera, et cetera. In a large corporation, they operate in a marketplace, but internally they are command economies. Okay. People are not paid per unit that they move inside Amazon by internal transactions. They're told to damn well move that box for a pay rate of X. or preferably pay a rate of half cents per dollar. So there is a command economy being quite successful inside the marketplace. And the question is, why does that happen? And it tends to be dramatic internal economies of scale, and then network effects for companies like Google. Once you Google, it's very hard for anybody else to be Google part two.
Yeah, that whole first mover advantage thing. But one of the disadvantages, and maybe it's less so in the digital age, but go back a few decades, we looked at multinationals as being those companies that were devastating third world countries. They were pushing prices up in those economies because they were bringing in high paid foreign workers. They were repatriating profits. So they were sort of like, cutting up the countryside, cutting out competitors, and taking the money out. They had slack environmental standards. So, think of Bhopal, the Union Carbide plant in India in 1984, where thousands of people were killed instantly, and then, many more thousands in the weeks that followed. All that sort of stuff obviously doesn't happen in North America or Europe because the nationally multinationals were just offering slack standards because human life doesn't matter so much there. They were the bad boys. Then we don't tend to see that so much because perhaps there's less of that stuff happening. But I can't help feeling that, some of that stuff is still going on in terms of, for example, closing down local businesses, obviously taking the profits out and raising prices and in economies and adding to inequality.
Yeah, and you're basically exploiting the differences between countries rather than countries using their differences as a source of comparative advantage. And again, here's an economic myth getting in the way of us understanding reality properly. Because they believe in comparative advantage, because they don't realize, in fact, the theory of comparative advantage, as wrong as it is, also assumes that capital doesn't move, neither capital nor labor move between countries, because that throws up the welfare calculations the theory makes. But of course, that is what happens. So they're exploiting, again, the naivety that our politicians have, and that naivety, the source of that naivety is mainstream economic theory.
So it seems like, just to finish off, the only thing we can do then is a tax on revenue, is a tax on transactions at the end point. And we seem to be trying to introduce that in the UK, 2% tax. They've been trying to do it in Europe, by the way, but, they were supposed to be doing that this year, but they're in the last few weeks, they fell apart. The agreement fell apart. They didn't quite manage to get it over the line. But as you say, everyone's got to do it, haven't they?
Yeah, and I think it is something which you'd need to have it internationally based to some extent, but it can still work on a national basis. But your idea as well of saying, okay, you've got to have a local partner, and let's even push it further. Let's make a local partner has to have worker ownership as well to some extent. Maybe that way we might get these being bring a bit of democracy into a very authoritarian system.
A flipping Marxist, aren't you,
I'm
Steve
a flipping
Keen?
Marxist, as always. Here we go.
Good stuff.
I want the workers to have shares. That makes me into a Marxist. Yeah.
I thought you were about to say up the workers. They're up the workers. So we'll see you again very soon, Steve. Thanks.
Bye, mate. Okay.
And next time, another subject a flaming Marxist would come up with: how is privatization working out for you? We're going to look at the railways. We're going to look at other state-owned utilities that have been privatized and ask whether it was a smart move or whether it was a step in the wrong direction. And can you pull them back? What should be privatized and what should stay in state ownership? We'll look at that next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll be back for that too. I'll see you then.